Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Now, moving from calories onto macronutrients, let's talk about how to set protein. Protein is the most important nutrient to build muscle, but there is no real difference in my approach to setting protein in a surplus compared to maintenance calories. My usual approach is to aim for at least 2 grams of protein per kilogram of current body mass. However, there is some research showing that more protein can yield better and better results with regards to muscle growth, with diminishing returns, however, beyond a certain threshold. Spoiler alert, I'm actually going to record a podcast with Dr. Eric Helms discussing this very topic, and it should be out the week after this one comes out, so stay tuned. In any case, because of this research, I typically tell my clients, you can eat at least 2 grams per kilogram of body mass, or more if you enjoy more protein, because there are these purported benefits based on the literature, as long as you don't start eating so much protein that now we are compromising the intake of other essential nutrients. For example, if now your fats are plummeting because you're eating 400 grams of protein, well, we've got to adjust that. And that's a good segue into discussing how I typically set carbs and fats. First of all, referring back to the Slater and colleagues paper from 2019, what they recommend in terms of macronutrient distribution, once you set protein, they suggest to keep carbs to 4 to 7 grams per kilograms of body mass per day in order to primarily support training performance. And they then recommend to keep fats within 20 to 35% of your total caloric intake. Now, my view differs slightly, but not particularly from their recommendations. I will say that I am not super strict with fats and carbs. I assign a minimum and a maximum target for dietary fat. I assign a protein range and a fiber range, and I typically leave carbs to fall where they may once the client has accomplished or has met these other nutritional targets. With regards to fats, they are essential for health, so I set a minimum for that reason, and I set a maximum to avoid overconsumption of calories and deprioritizing carbohydrates. I typically assign a range from 0.5 grams to 1.5 grams of dietary fat per kilogram of body mass per day. And the sweet spot that I found is to be around 1 gram per kilogram of body mass per day. This is what I consider a sweet spot because it's certainly enough to maintain and support your well-being, but it's also not so much that it compromises your carbohydrate intake. From my perspective, prioritizing carbs in a bulking phase is reasonable because carbs are the primary fuel for resistance training. So if we have enough carbs, we are going to maximize performance. Having said that, based on the Slater and colleagues paper, as well as several articles written in the research reviews that I read on the regular to inform my own opinion and my methods, around 4 to 7 grams of carbohydrate per day seem to be plenty to maximize adaptations in a bulking phase. And for most people with an average caloric intake at maintenance, achieving this amount of carbohydrate in a surplus is absolutely reasonable. It's even reasonable to get to 3 to 5 grams when in a caloric maintenance state. So I am not particularly worried about carbohydrates in a bulking phase, but I still keep an eye on my clients' intake of carbs and fats and typically edge my bets towards encouraging them to eat more carbs. However, I also take a personalized approach whereby some people feel better on a higher fat intake. So if they don't like the sweet spot of 1 gram per kilogram, 1 gram of fat per kilogram of body mass per day, I encourage them to experiment and see if going up to 1.2 or 1.5 makes them feel better. I also want to touch on a different scenario in which there are some people who need a disproportionate surplus in order to gain weight because they are very adaptable, or rather their metabolism is very adaptable, in that when I increase their calories from maintenance, their metabolism adapts by making them do more subconscious activity. So they actually get an increase in their maintenance calories, and I need to keep increasing their food to a reasonable amount, honestly, sometimes, until we finally manage to outpace those adaptations. In that case, it may be necessary to increase your fats beyond the sweet spot of 1 gram per kilogram of body mass in order to attain that extreme calorie surplus, and or to avoid digestive distress that can come from eating excess fiber from the carbohydrates, or from simply eating too many carbohydrate containing foods. Some people may find that they struggle digestively or with appetite, whereas eating more fats is typically easier on both the digestive system and appetite. Ultimately, this is to say, the approach to macronutrient distribution beyond protein, so when it comes to carbs and fats, is very individual. The average person within the range of the surpluses that I assign doesn't particularly struggle to have enough carbohydrates to train and to not overdo their dietary fats. So my first concern is the protein, and I'm not especially concerned with your carbs to fat ratio, as long as you're not on either extreme end, one extreme being you're in a keto diet, because I don't believe that that would be as beneficial as having carbohydrate in your diet, but also you don't want to be on the opposite end of the extreme spectrum where now you have no fats, no dietary fats, and that affects your well-being. And if anything, if your preference is a higher fat diet, but now you've listened to this podcast and you think that you need to really lower your fat intake, and you do so at the expense of your enjoyment of your own diet, lifestyle, and of the process of bulking, I don't think that jacking up your carbs as much as possible and keeping your dietary fats to the bare minimum you need for health is a strategy worth the effort. With regards to fiber, which is another nutritional target I set, the typical recommendation is to consume 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories eaten, but this recommendation assumes maintenance calories rather than a surplus. When you are in a surplus, you could end up eating so much fiber that you're now compromising your digestive system. So my recommendation when bulking is to start with a minimum of 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day. And if you enjoy high fiber foods, to keep an eye on your intake and to stop when you realize that you're getting within a territory where you have digestive issues. For example, you are getting loose stools or an increased bowel movement frequency, an excessively increased bowel movement frequency that compromises the rest of your lifestyle in a way that you don't like, or the extreme of developing diarrhea, or maybe you're a little bit too gassy for your liking, or you're a little bit too bloated. In any case, if you are consuming too much fiber, your gut will tell you. So just keep an eye on it and stay within the 25 to 35 gram range as a minimum. And if you want to increase, make sure that you're not getting digestive distress that you're unhappy with, because digestion is really important for the absorption and utilization of nutrients. So it's not just about how you feel, which is very important. If you feel crappy, pun intended, you may be eating too much fiber. But also, if your digestive system isn't working properly because it is overwhelmed by this much fiber, now you're not digesting and absorbing nutrients as you could, and that is going to potentially have a negative impact on your ability to utilize those nutrients to support muscle growth. The next topic I want to discuss within the realm of nutrition is your food quality. My suggestion is to first and foremost focus on meeting your nutritional requirements with health-promoting whole foods. But you can also use discretionary foods like cookies, ice cream, you know the drill, you know which foods I'm referring to make up the remaining calories you need to achieve your surplus once you've met those nutritional requirements. In general, the 80-20 rule, 80% whole health-promoting foods, 20% discretionary foods, is ideal. But in a surplus, there are some extreme scenarios in which people need to eat so many calories that they could be really struggling I can talk. They're really struggling with their appetite, or they may be getting a lot of GI distress. And for that reason, you may find yourself having to consume more discretionary foods than you may be comfortable with. Put in different terms, the more whole foods you can eat without digestive distress or other negative impacts on your well-being and on your ability to meet your surplus targets, the better, because these foods nourish your body, and a healthy body is more responsive to training and therefore to growth. But once you do get negative impacts, then the discretionary foods are going to help. The next topic I want to discuss is nutrient timing. First of all, in my view, it's important to prioritize your peri-workout nutrition, or the meals that you have before, after, and potentially during a workout. In particular, with regards to specific nutrients, I would prioritize carbohydrates and protein before, potentially during, and after. For the reasons I've already stated, protein is the most important nutrient to support growth. Carbs help support training performance. With regards to fats and fiber, I would be conscious about not eating a high amount of fat or a high amount of fiber, or a combination of the two, too close to training, in order to avoid GI distress from the incomplete digestive process, because both fats and fiber slow down digestion. But I would encourage you to experiment, because what's too close to a workout for you may not be too close for me. So experiment with it a little bit, and if your digestion isn't impacted negatively, you're training and you're fine, don't worry about it. In the past, I was intrigued by a suggestion that I heard from other coaches in this space to limit dietary fat pre and post training in order to speed up recovery. But to this date, I haven't really found convincing evidence in support of this, nor have I seen a difference in dietary fat intake to make a substantial difference in my practice. So I wanted to bring it up in case you've heard of this as well, but at this moment in time, my view is that I'm not particularly concerned about it. I want to touch on fasted training, because I know that some people can only train really early in the morning and they won't have the time to eat beforehand. And if you are concerned about this, I would say that if you must train fasted and you don't have the ability to eat beforehand without feeling sick, Certainly protect your sleep. Don't wake up too early in order to eat and have the time to digest if that means that your sleep is going to be negatively impacted. Secondarily, I would consider your pre-workout meal to be dinner the night before, because you are going to use up some glycogen overnight, but you're not going to use up all of it. And glycogen is the form of carbohydrate stored within your muscles and liver once it's been absorbed and digested. Digested and absorbed, actually, that's the correct order. In addition to that, I would also consider drinking a protein shake on your way to the gym and potentially a fast digesting carbohydrate drink to be consumed right before and within the first third of your session, so that those fast digesting carbs have the time to be digested, absorbed, and shuttled to your muscles for utilization. Some examples of fast digesting carbohydrates include an intra-workout carbohydrate drink called maltodextrin. If you look this up, many supplement companies like MyProtein, Bulk, Bodybuilding Warehouse, Legion sell one. Or it could be as simple as a Gatorade, a Powerade, or a Lucozade. All of these are really fast digesting carbs. I would suggest starting to drink one bottle about 20 minutes, 15 minutes before a workout, and then 20 minutes, 30 minutes in, you want to have finished it by then, just to make sure that you are digesting it in time to actually be utilized during the workout itself. And once you're done with the session, I would make an effort to eat ASAP afterwards. And I would have a complete meal with carbohydrates, protein, and a little bit of dietary fat as well. Nutrition is obviously the main component of the nutrition and lifestyle chapter, so I spent a lot of time talking about it. I will say I also have a solo podcast talking about peri-workout nutrition, so I would listen to that for more information specifically on what to eat before, after, and during a session. But now I want to move on to the two components of the nutrition and lifestyle chapter I haven't touched on yet, one being sleep and the other being stress management. With regards to sleep, we know that on average, adults need 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but this is variable and it depends on the demands placed upon you by your current lifestyle. The greater the demands, the greater your amount of sleep is likely going to be. The greater your sleep requirements are going to be, that is. But it's also dependent on genetics. Some people need more sleep than others. In addition to that, it's not only sleep quantity that's important, but also sleep efficiency and sleep quality. And sleep efficiency is essentially of the amount of hours that you spend in bed, which is actually what we're able to measure most of the time. For example, my Fitbit measures the amount of hours that I spend in bed. I am less confident about the distinctions it makes between the time I spend awake and the time I spend asleep. Your sleep efficiency is the ratio of time spent awake to time spent asleep. And the more time you spend asleep, obviously, the greater your sleep efficiency. Your sleep quality is how well rested the sleep that you do get makes you, and the more well rested you are, the greater your sleep quality is. So while we do want to aim for 7 to 9 hours, it's also important to pay attention to sleep quality and efficiency. In very simple terms, if you sleep 7 hours and you wake up rested and ready for the day, you're sleeping enough. If you sleep 7 hours, but you wake up because of an alarm, but you have to wake up to an alarm or otherwise you would never get out of bed, and you feel like you're always tired and fatigued, then you need to be looking at your sleep a little bit more in detail. I have an episode on sleep, which is episode 92, Evidence-Based Sleep Tips for Health, Muscle Growth, and Fat Loss, with Greg Potter, who has a PhD on sleep. So I strongly encourage you to check out that one, especially if you've already tried a lot of sleep suggestions and they've not worked for you, because he made a point of specifically talking about sleep tips for people who feel like they've tried everything. Now, with regards to stress management, I said before that you're likely not going to be perfect and have a stress free life. That's not expected, and it's not a requirement to make the most of a bulking phase. However, if you find yourself chronically super stressed, that's going to have a negative influence on muscle growth, primarily because you're going to feel like shit and you're going to likely underperform compared to if you were less stressed, but also because you're going to find it harder to make health promoting and goal aligned choices with regards to training and nutrition. It's far easier to fall to the temptation of skipping a session or eating burgers and fries when you know that it's not the best for you at that moment in time if you're super tired from being stressed all day than if you were not. So that's why stress management is something to consider. In addition to that, within the realm of stress management, you also need to take into account that training is a stressor in and of itself. So, as I mentioned in chapter 4, it's important to balance training against the rest of your life so that you're not training so much that you can never recover from it, and you're not training so little that you're not causing an adaptation. And that's a wrap for chapter 5. So, let's move into chapter 6, which is going to be about how to interpret scale weight and the other progress markers that I use in a bulking phase. First off, I am going to list all of the progress markers: scale weight, physique pictures, measurements, training performance, BMI, and biofeedback. Importantly, I don't use every single metric with everyone. There are some non-negotiables, but there are some that are more appropriate for some people and less appropriate for others. So once again, it's a case-by-case basis. At this point, you should know that my one-to-one coaching service is very, very personalized, so I'm not going to belabor that point. Let's start with your scale weight. As I mentioned in chapter 2, weight changes are more linear for most people in a fat loss phase than in a bulking phase. In a bulking phase, I find that there are weeks when you gain pretty linearly and you're right on target. Other weeks, you're not gaining at all. And some other weeks, you're gaining more than you expected, which is why I don't typically make changes to somebody's surplus calories any more frequently than every 2 weeks. But honestly, it's more likely to be every 4 weeks, especially if somebody has a regular menstrual cycle, which is going to muddy the waters even further. In addition to that, as a note specifically about the first week or two in a surplus, be aware of the fact that you're going to see a spike in weight, likely beyond your expected rate of gain, because of an increase in water, which comes from the increase in carbohydrate consumption, because every gram of carbohydrate gets stored with about 3 to 4 grams of water. So you eat more carbs, you're going to store them as glycogen. That glycogen is going to have extra weight, but also the water absorbed with it is going to have extra weight. In addition to that, you are going to have more food in your gut, most likely, from being in a surplus. And I also find that, especially with my clients who are bulking for the first time ever, they typically increase their training frequency. It's not uncommon for me to have a client who started with 3 days of training and then moved to 4 when they decided to go into a surplus. That is going to cause an increase in inflammation because you are delivering an increased and novel stimulus to your muscles through that new program. And inflammation is totally normal in response to training, and it does result in an increase in water retention. So for all these reasons, I would typically ignore the first week or 2 in a bulking phase. And I would take the following weeks as reliable data to decide whether you are on track or not with the rate of gain that you are targeting over a month. Because, as I said in the chapter about nutrition, I typically set a surplus calorie target with a view of achieving a certain rate of gain over a month, as opposed to trying to set the target as a specific number of calories above maintenance. Now, I used to be a lot more strict about staying within a certain percentage of body weight gain per month. And that percentage has also changed over time. Initially, I targeted 1 to 2% of body weight gain per month, mainly because I didn't have a lot of coaching experience and I was relying on recommendations I heard from other coaches and researchers in the space that I trust. Now I have nearly 6 years of experience at this point, working with a lot of clients. And based on my typical clients, I found that targeting 0.5 up to 1.5, and in some cases up to 2% of body weight gain per month is a better range. So it's essentially a larger range than it was before. I found that this range helps us ensure that we're in a surplus, so we're definitely gaining weight, which is important if the goal is to build muscle at the fastest rate possible. But it also helps with mindset, especially with my clients who tend to struggle the most with the idea of gaining weight. Then setting our sights on the slower rate of gain at 0.5 to 1% helps them get used to it with less stress. And also aiming for 0.5 to 1.5% helps increase the duration of the bulking phase, because since I work with a lot more clients who are concerned with excessive fat gain versus less concerned, then I also don't want to gain at too fast a pace, not because they would gain too much fat and become unhealthy, but because they would gain too much fat relative to what they are comfortable with. And that would end our bulking phase a little bit too soon, in my view, sometimes, to make a significant improvement to their physique. So I would rather rein in the rate of gain in order to give us a longer time to bulk. However, I also said that I am less strict about this because there are often cases in my coaching experience where this rate simply doesn't apply, because unlike other coaches, I work with a lot of clients who are on testosterone to transition from female to their chosen gender. And in this situation, the testosterone causes body weight fluctuations that are often disproportionate to the rate of gain of 0.5 to 1.5% of body weight per month, or even 2% per month in some cases. For example, it's not uncommon for a client who just started testosterone to see that their body weight changes exceed that rate of gain. But when I look at other metrics like their pictures and their measurements, they suggest that they are gaining a lot of muscle without very much body fat. When I know that the circumstances justify being more relaxed about the rate of body weight gain, then I am. Because in the past, I was a little too strict with it, and I believe that I held my clients back to an extent that now I tend to avoid. So situations in which I would justify an increased rate of muscle gain, or body weight gain rather, per month, are all situations in which, yes, you're gaining a little bit faster than expected, but your pictures and your measurements show favorable changes towards muscle gain, and you're not displeased with the rate of fat gain. And the two main scenarios that fall under that category, in my experience, are number one, as I've just said, if you are on testosterone therapy, and particularly at the beginning of therapy, even on a lower dose. So if you are microdosing, I have found that you can expect, in some cases, a faster rate of gain than what I've just suggested. but it might kick in a few weeks later than it would if you were on a full dose. If you are on a full dose, it might happen a little bit sooner. The second scenario is if you have lost muscle and you're now rebuilding that lost muscle, and that is because lost muscle comes back faster than completely new muscle. Now, having talked at length about scale weight, including pros and cons of it, I want to focus on the other tools I use to track progress. With regards to tools to assess body fat accumulation as well as muscle growth, I also use progress pictures, waist measurements, and BMI. With regards to progress pictures, I usually ask clients to take them on a monthly basis, unless I expect that they are a unique case and might put on muscle a little bit faster than under different circumstances, or if I believe that perhaps they might undergo body recomposition, in which case their body weight alone on a weekly basis wouldn't be enough to understand what's going on. For example, if they were undergoing body recomposition, their scale weight might not change at all, in which case I might think, oh, they're not in an appropriate surplus. And then if I were to check their pictures, I would realize, they are building muscle, but they are also losing body fat at the same time. However, if you're not in one of these unique circumstances and we see that your body weight is going up at the rate that I would expect, then progress pictures taken once a month are plenty frequent. In fact, I wouldn't check them month to month expecting to see a night or day difference. I take them on a monthly basis to have enough of a record over time, but I wouldn't expect to see wild differences in pictures for at least 3 to 6 months at a time. And the biggest difference that you're going to see is likely when you go through a fat loss phase, assuming that you don't want to stay at your peak bulk weight. And once you've gone through that fat loss phase, you go back to the starting body weight you were at the beginning of your bulk, or slightly heavier or maybe slightly leaner, depending on your goal. And then you compare those pictures to the beginning of your bulk. And that's when you're going to see the greatest difference, assuming that you had a successful bulk. Other than that, progress pictures are mainly for the sake of record keeping, not because I would expect you to see extreme differences from month to month in a bulking phase. With regards to waist measurements, I use them to ensure that a client is maintaining a healthy waist to height ratio, which is an evidence-based way to check for visceral fat gain, because visceral fat gain is the most dangerous type of fat, or rather, visceral fat is the most dangerous type of body fat in terms of the risk that it poses to our health. And I use the waist to height ratio in conjunction with BMI, because unlike BMI, waist to height ratio helps to differentiate between muscle gain and fat gain. However, BMI is still a helpful tool to assess that whether overall body mass still falls within a healthy range. As for other body measurements, I tend to find them to be more reliable in a calorie deficit because fat loss occurs more rapidly than muscle gain, as I touched on earlier. So you're likely going to see a change in measurement over a few weeks or a few months that is reflective of your fat loss. Whereas even after a few months in a surplus, the changes that you may get in your measurements are likely to come mainly from fat gain. And if you want to use measurements to assess muscle growth, I would do so over a much longer time span. For example, let's say you start your bulk at 150 pounds and then you gain 10 pounds, you get to 160, you diet back down to around 150. At that point, it might be 6 months to a year total, probably more like 9 to a year actually. And then you assess your measurements again, and you may find that maybe your arm measurements and your thigh measurements are a little bit bigger, but your waist measurements have gone down a little. Then you can essentially use the measurements to confirm what you will also see in pictures visually, which is that you have built more muscle and lost a little bit of body fat by going through the process of bulking and cutting. And so at the same weight, you now have a greater percentage of muscle mass and a lower percentage of body fat. So, in summary, scale weight, physique pictures, waist measurements, and BMI are the tools I use to keep track of body composition. Now, another tool for progress that I use that's very, very important is your training performance, because as I said earlier, in a bulking phase, training is the priority to put on muscle. So we want to see that training performance go up over time. Of course, training performance can't be forced to increase at a rate that you want. It's going to increase at a rate that's relative not only to the quality of your training and the fact that you're in a surplus, but also, and importantly, it's going to go up at a rate that's relative to your level of advancement, whereby the more advanced you are as a lifter, the more years of consistent and high quality lifting you have under your belt, the slower training performance is going to be. Finally, I also utilize biofeedback. I routinely ask my clients how they're feeling, how they're sleeping, how their stress level is, what their energy level looks like, where their appetite is at, and how they feel in their body at a certain body weight. And I put together all these indices of progress from scale weight all the way to biofeedback and all the others I've mentioned so far, and I assess whether we are progressing at an appropriate rate. And I really want to stress this point because a lot of people make a bulking phase all about how much weight you're gaining and how fast. And when you do that, you can run into two different scenarios, both of which will hold you back. One is the scenario I personally found myself in, whereby if the weight on the scale was going up at a rate that made me uncomfortable, and since I was quite afraid of fat gain, it was very easy to make me uncomfortable, to make my toes curl, then I would take myself out of a surplus because I thought that the weight gain was too fast, and I would simply revert back to maintenance for no reason whatsoever, and I would end up spinning my wheels. The other scenario is that you are so keen on seeing the scale go up faster that you end up putting on more body fat than you would have wanted to, and then you look back on it and you think, now I have to stop my bulking phase sooner than I would have had I been a little bit more conservative. So I encourage you to take all of these tools into account instead, to try to get a more insightful picture into whether you should change anything or keep going as you have. And that is the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7, our final chapter, is all about when to stop bulking. There are 3 scenarios under which I would call for the end of a bulk. The first scenario, which has really never occurred in my experience, is when your BMI and or your waist to height ratio and or your physique pictures show that you're getting close to being dangerously overweight or to developing obesity. And this scenario has really never occurred because on one hand, I am careful not to make my clients unhealthy. But on the other hand, the second scenario usually takes place first, whereby the client comes to me expressing discomfort with their current shape and size. The juice is no longer worth the squeeze to them, while previously they were okay with a moderate amount of fat gain in order to accrue more muscle mass. That's no longer the case. And so we call off the bulk. The final scenario is when the client might not necessarily feel really uncomfortable just yet, but in a check-in, I remind them of the fact that fat loss isn't going to occur overnight, and we need to consider how far from their more comfortable body weight range they want to get. And we consider how many weeks or months of fat loss they are happy to go through in order to return to that leaner state. And when we come to the conclusion together that they don't want to add any more weeks of fat loss by accruing any more body weight, then that's the final scenario in which I would end the bulk. However, before contemplating the end of a bulk, give it at a minimum 4 months. Although, to be honest, the longer you can bulk for, the more muscle you're going to put on. In my experience with the majority of my clients, 6 months tends to be the sweet spot where you gain enough body weight to make a change to your physique, but you also don't gain so much body fat that it's going to take a really long time to take it off, or that you are going to feel really, really uncomfortable with your body weight, or worse, you're going to put yourself in a position where your health is compromised. And that is a wrap for this honestly a monster of an episode. I titled this A Comprehensive Guide to Bulking, and man, was I comprehensive. I am not going to summarize everything I have just talked about, but I will end this by restating again that, in case it's not clear enough, that we don't have a lot of research on bulking phases. And I rely on what little research we do have, as well as my own coaching experience. But ultimately, you must have noticed that I've been saying throughout, it depends on the specific circumstances, and these circumstances can vary a lot from client to client. So to an extent, even more so than in a fat loss phase, when we do have a lot of research on fat loss, and also a lot more coaching experience, to be honest, because many more people want to lose fat than they want to bulk, then even more so than in a deficit, you have to trust the process and do your best not to hold yourself back by either fearing the scale or obsessing over the scale having to go up faster. Again, re-listen to chapter 6 about interpreting scale weight and other progress markers, because it's really important that, more so than only your scale weight, or more so than only the way you feel in your body, or more so than the way that you look in pictures, you want to take into account all these tools, these progress markers, and then more, all of those that I've mentioned, to ensure that you're making the best decision, whether that's to continue bulking, to stop bulking, or to make an alteration to your rate of weight gain. On that note, thank you very much for listening. If you do have a muscle gain goal, I love taking people through bulking phases, because typically it's quite new for them. It's really exciting, and it's wonderful to see the muscle mass come on, and then the shreds come in when we go through a fat loss phase, if that's appropriate for them. Or it's super rewarding when somebody is underweight and they finally achieve a shape that's a little bit fuller and that they're happier with as well. I basically love every facet of a muscle building phase. So if that's what you're after right now, I would love to take you through the process. So please get in touch for coaching. Other than that, as always, I am super thankful for your attention, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.